vou dar início ao nosso webinar. Contamos nesse momento com público de 80
We have about 80 people in here, and I thank you very much for being here with us today.
Novamente, eu sou João Henrique.
I'm João Henrique, the coordinator of the Illicit Market Census. This is a project which has started almost 2 years ago, and the goal is for us to organize data about illicit markets, increase the knowledge and the response by the state and the society to this kind of an issue. I'd like to thank all of you for being in here today, and also to thank our two friends and speakers today. David, thank you very much. I know your time is very limited all the time, but David is an American diplomat. He has been the head of the task force of illicit market in OECD, and he's the main authority in the topic at this current moment, and he's involved in lots of other activities. He has a very intense schedule, but he's leading the team of experts that is handling illicit markets within OECD, on top of other initiatives in the United States, particularly organizing initiatives when it comes to this area. David, thank you very much. And David and Leandro were with us when we opened this seminar at USP in 2019, introducing this project, and they are here with us today. This is not the closing of the project. The project ends in July. And then in July, we're going to have the product of several sectorial capacity buildings that we put in place, which have this goal that we are bringing up to you right now, but I'm going to tell you about that later. We also have Leandro Piquet Carneiro, one of the professors at USP, one of the main authorities in this topic in Brazil. And he has been one of the first people to have this kind of a topic at the university, being approached for studies and talking about the illicit market, particularly for drugs. And over the last 10 years, we had more people joining this front. But Leandro is leading this in the international relations chair at the university, and of course he is working with our sponsor for projects, and we have several integrations. So we have David in here today with a very clear vision with government, private initiative, and the risk of illicit markets that we have globally, and we have Leandro with a technical academical approach, and this is very important for us to complement this approach in such a complicated market, so to speak.
Fazendo a minha apresentação, eu preparei material, né?
So I'm going to start my presentation, and I'm going to cover this within a period of 30 minutes. And I will be presenting our report, explaining the focus, and then after that, I will hand it over to David, and after that, Leandro is going to take over, and at the end, we're going to have some 10 or 15 minutes for questions to be answered, all right? Okay, so the report for illicit market census will be made available today for all of you who are here in the meeting and those who are visiting our website. So this is the kind of material that is the beginning of the explanation of the focus of the census and how this kind of data is organized in Brazil, and this is really important. I'd like to introduce that to you, but I prefer to use a presentation in PowerPoint format so we are more dynamic. So we're going to go back to the census every now and then, And
sobre
I'm gonna open some
a
more
nossa abordagem,
information
né?
we have in here about our
Mas
approach.
antes, eu preciso, como primeiro ato, falar do
But first
programa
and
PMI
foremost, I
IMPACT, que
need to
é o
tell you
programa
about the
que
PMI
iniciou
IMPACT
todo
Program,
o
which is the
processo,
program
é um
that has
programa
funded all of the
Script Morris
census.
Impact.
This is a
A
program
gente nós
called
agora
Crypt
formamos
Morris
um
Intact.
conselho de especialistas que são
And this is the
ex-integrantes
council
sêniores
of
de
specialists that are
entidades
former
como
senior
o Alto
members
Comissariado de
of
Direitos
entities
Humanos da
such as the
ONU, ex-dirigentes da
high
Europol,
commissioners
alguns
of human
ex-promotores
rights for the United
Tribunal
Nations,
Penal Internacional,
some
algumas
people
autoridades
at
que lidam com o tema mundo
Interpol and the
afora
Foreign
já há algum tempo.
International
E aí ela
Forum,
fez
and some
um segundo
authorities that
edital,
have
ela
been
selecionou
handling with these
29 projetos, inicialmente
kind of
31.
topics all
Nós
over the
estamos
year.
aqui dessa
And the
lista,
second
né?
version of the
Junto com uma série
project,
aqui da
they have
Universidade de São
selected
Paulo
29
e uma
projects, and
série
we
de
are here in
outras
this list
ações,
along
os
with the
quais
São
não
Paulo
seria
University
possível serem
and
realizadas se
many
não
other
houvesse não só o
initiatives
apoio em
which
termos
would
de
not
fundo,
have
mas
become
principalmente pela rede que foi
feasible
criada em
if
torno
not
desses
for the
assuntos.
funding support,
Hoje nós temos
and
contato com
mostly
a
for the
Polícia
network
Argentina,
that we have
Gendarmeria,
in
temos
place.
contato com o
Now we
Paraguai,
have
temos
contact
contato
with the
com
Argentinian
algumas
Gendarmeria,
ótimas
with the
iniciativas que foram feitas no
Paraguayan
leste europeu, exatamente pela rede que foi criada dentro desse
police
programa.
force, and many initiatives that
O
have been
censo
carried
de
out in
mercados
Europe
ilícitos,
as a result of
ele
this
está
initiative. The illicit market
disponibilizado
census
dentro da nossa
has
plataforma.
been made available within our platform. Just bear with me
Nosso
for a
site
second.
Economia
This
Ilícita,
is our
ele integra
website
uma
called Economia
abordagem
Illicita or
quase
Illicit Economy,
holística
and
sobre o
it
problema que
has more
começa
of a
no
holistic
item 1,
approach in
onde a
this
necessidade de definir o
issue.
que
And
é
the first
economia
item
ilícita,
is
o que é
a
mercado ilícito,
definition on
como é que
what
ele se
an
apresenta para
illicit
nós, porque
economy
esse é o
is
nosso
and
problema.
how this
Na
presents
ciência, a gente
itself
sabe que o
to us,
primeiro
because this
passo
is
para
our
iniciar um
problem.
bom trabalho de pesquisa é
In
definir
science, we know that the
claramente qual é o
first step
problema. E
to
isso,
do
infelizmente,
good
não é
research is to define
claramente
clearly what the
definido.
problem is.
O
And
censo
unfortunately, this is not
vem a
clearly defined.
auxiliar a definição
So
desse
the
problema,
census
que é o
comes
primeiro
in
passo
to
aqui nesse mindset.
help
O censo também
defining this
ajuda a
issue.
demonstrar que
And it
boa
also
parte da
helps
consequência da
showing
violência
that
criminal,
the consequence of criminal
que eu
violence, or at
prefiro
least
enquadrar isso
most
dentro
of the consequence
da
of criminal violence,
vitimização,
and I
inclusive da
prefer to
vitimização que muitas vezes
look
conflita a
into
sociedade com as próprias forças policiais, por uma
victimization,
questão
which
de
puts society in a
desempenho.
conflict with
Na verdade, tudo isso é
the
consequência da intensa atividade desses
police
mercados
forces. This
ilícitos,
is
né? O tráfico de
basically a
drogas, o
consequence of the
roubo, o
intense activity of
contrabando. Isso
illicit
cria uma
markets, like
demanda
drug
excessiva para as polícias.
trafficking,
Essas polícias precisam dar
theft,
resposta para tudo ao mesmo
smuggling, and
tempo.
the
O
police has
cidadão
to
acaba
face
sendo
all of
vitimizado
this,
por vários momentos,
and the
e aí
citizen is
a gente vai
victimized several
perdendo a noção da origem
times.
do
So we
problema, né?
lose
Você acaba tendo uma
track
discussão
of the
sobre
source of the
o
problem. So we keep
atendimento, sobre
talking
a
about how
resposta, e
to
perde a
fight
noção que o
the
problema
issue,
é o mercado, né? E que gera várias consequências
but we
implicadas nessa
lose track
exploração do
that this
Estado, e aí a gente
the problem is
consegue ter um
basically the
efeito que é
market
muitas vezes
itself, and the
gravíssimo.
state is basically dragged into this
A
in
causa
a
desse problema,
non-optimal
Gary
scenario.
Becker, um economista,
The root cause
ganhador
of
do
this
Nobel, já nos
problem,
ajudou
Eddie
a visualizar
Becker
isso lá atrás. Quer dizer, o
helped
crime,
us
assim
visualizing this
como
back in the
o
day.
crime em especial, o criminoso,
Crime,
como
and
qualquer ator
particularly
racional, ele
any
age por
criminal
incentivos
act,
e por motivações relacionadas
given
ao
incentives and
custo-benefício.
motivations connected
Se
to
o
the
custo é baixo, se o
cost
risco é
benefit
baixo, o
ratio.
custo é
So if
baixo, você
the
tem
cost is low,
pro
if the risk
criminoso,
is low for
você
the
tem um
criminal,
incentivo incremental a essa
you
ação.
have
Então, a gente precisa
an
identificar qual é o
additional
mercado, identificar como os
incentive for
criminosos
this
agem,
activity. So we
para
have to
começar a
identify the
tratar da
market, how
causa
criminals
e ir para a
act, and to
solução, que
start
é a gente
handling the cause,
reestruturar o
and the solution,
nosso
which is basically
ordenamento jurídico, os nossos
restructuring
modelos de
our
governança, tanto de
legal
segurança pública quanto
organization
privada,
and
para
public and
conseguir
private safety
aumentar o custo para a atividade criminal naquilo que é mais
security issues, in
sensível
fact,
para eles.
to
E a gente já
fight
adianta
criminals
que
and hit them hard
quando a gente
where
consegue
they
focar a
hurt the
cadeia
most.
logística dos operadores criminais
When we
e a
can
cadeia
focus on the
financeira, a gente consegue
logistics
ter um
and
resultado mais
financial chains
significativo
for criminals,
naquela
we
relação de
can
custo-benefício a favor
have
do
more of
criminoso.
a
Tudo
meaningful
isso
result
está dentro da plataforma
for
Economia Ilícita.
the impact on the
A
cost
plataforma
benefit
Economia
ratio
Ilícita
that we
ela
mentioned.
tem a função de
And this is all
organizar
in the
esses dados, ou
platform
para a gente
that
organizar o
we have for
processamento
PMI. And
disso,
the
a
idea is
partir
to
da nossa base
organize
de dados,
this kind of a
que é o
data based
censo.
on our
Isso está aqui
database, which is the
distribuído,
census.
vocês vão encontrar aqui painel censo
So we have
uma
here
série de
the
dashboards
census panel with a series
apresentando
of
gráficos já
dashboards and
organizados em tabela, em
data that
graus,
has been
e também
organized
vai
like
encontrar
tables
um
and charts,
mapeamento sobre a distribuição da atividade
and
criminal no meio
also to map the distribution
do
of criminal
espaço geográfico.
activity
Ok, agora
in
eu vou
the
retirar
geographical
o ele aqui,
landscape.
voltar para a
So I'm gonna
apresentação,
leave
porque a gente
here
vai
and get back to the
todo
presentation
ir e
because
voltar, né?
we're gonna have a
Ser
lot of
dinâmico
comings and
depois.
goings, and I have to be more dynamic
Vamos lá.
here.
Então, a primeira questão todos nós sentimos um mal-estar
So
da
the first
atividade
thing is that
criminal. Essa pesquisa feita
we
pela
feel
CNI,
the
eu sempre gosto de
pinch of
citar
all of
ela
the
porque ela é
criminal
impressionante,
activity.
né? Um terço das empresas foram vítimas de
And
roubo ou furto no
one
Brasil.
third of companies
É um
have been
absurdo.
a
É
victim of
gigantesco isso. Eu fiz a
robbery,
primeira
theft, or
pesquisa de
vandalism, and
vitimização
this
de
is an
empresas pela
absurd.
Fiesp em 2000, um
And
ano
I
antes da
did the
pesquisa do
first
CNI,
research
e nós chegamos no mesmo resultado
1
pelo
year
estado de
before
São Paulo.
CNI, and we got the
Quando
same
você olha para a
numbers for the
vitimização
São Paulo
pessoal, não é
state.
diferente. 4 em cada 10 famílias têm vítimas
And
de furto, assalto ou
of
agressão.
course,
Percebam que a
families are exposed to
vitimização,
the
a
same kind
gente
of a
por muito
thing.
tempo
And
tratou muito sobre homicídio no Brasil, tem que
victimization, and
tratar,
we've
o
been
Brasil
talking
ainda está
about homicides in
muito
Brazil,
alto
and
de
we have to
homicídio.
handle that
Mas o
because
que é
that's a high
importante a gente
number in
perceber que a
here. But what's
vitimização,
important
agora,
for
quando a
us to
violência
highlight is that
criminal
victimization,
atinge as pessoas, ela
when
atinge
criminal
principalmente
violence
através
hits
da
people,
busca de
it's
produtos.
mostly
Então,
because
da
criminals are
busca ou da
trying to
defesa ou da
obtain
ação em
products.
razão de produtos.
And when people
Então,
try to fight
organizamos dados
criminals
a
and
partir de 3 grupos criminais de
defend
tráfico, o
their
contrabando e o
ground.
roubo.
So from traffic,
A vitimização será cruzada entre elas o tempo
smuggling,
todo.
and
A gente
robbery, all this
precisa, antes
information is
de
cross-referenced
pensar o tipo
amongst
penal,
itself. So
pensar
before
qual
we
é o
think
objetivo do
about
criminoso.
the
Esse é
penal
o primeiro dado
type of
significativo que o
criminals, we
censo nos
have to
traz.
think about what their
Após
main
analisar
goal is.
11
This is the
milhões de
most
registros
important thing that we
criminais, nós
have to assess.
encontramos
After analyzing
como
11
alvo do
million criminal
criminoso
records, we've seen
85%
that
dos registros.
85%
Isso faz todo
of
sentido para o momento que nós vivemos
the
de
records
digitalização
show
da
that
economia, né? O
the
dinheiro
motivation
digital, o dinheiro
was the
plástico,
items,
o próprio
and
aumento
sometimes,
da
plastic
capacidade da
money and
segurança
digital
bancária,
money is
ela tem
also
dificultado
something
cada
that is a
vez mais
target.
o
And
acesso ao dinheiro em cash.
banks
É
have
óbvio que nós
made
temos
it more
exemplos de
difficult for people
roubos
to have
que param
access in
cidades, mas
cash.
exatamente
Of
esse é
course,
um
we
efeito
have
desse
different
processo.
types of
Para você
theft,
conseguir
but this
roubar
is an
roubar
effect of this
banco
process.
hoje,
So
você
if
precisa de uma ação
for
de
people to
guerra
be able
contra isso.
to rob a
No
bank,
entanto,
you
os
need
criminosos
kind of a
percebem que
guerrilla
quando
action
em vez de você ir
or a
direto ao
war
dinheiro, se você
initiative.
obtém um
So
produto, seja ele um
criminals realize
celular,
that
um
instead of
carro
going
ou
straight
a
for cash,
cocaína,
if you
ou o
get
cigarro que
a
foi roubado,
smartphone, a
esses produtos
car,
promoviam dinheiro e dão uma
cigarette,
margem de lucratividade
or
para
even
instituição.
cocaine, these
Tanto é assim
products become
que todos
money
os
and they
nossos
give them a
a
high
discussão sobre
profitability.
lavagem de dinheiro,
And the
ela
discussion on
tem
money
4
laundering
grandes áreas.
has 4 main pillars.
3 delas estão ligadas a atividades
3 of
ilícitas e
them
a
are
principal
connected to
são os mercados
illicit
ilícitos, na
activities.
medida que
The
o
most important of
comerciante
them are
de
illegal
droga
markets or illicit
ilícita, de
markets.
cigarro
When
contrabandeado, de
people trade
celular ou
illicit
veículos
drugs
roubados,
or
na medida que ele tem sucesso em
smuggled
criar uma série de
cigarettes
doenças que
or
é muito sucesso, ele
smartphones or
precisa
stolen
do
cars, and
processo de
when they are
lavagem de dinheiro.
successful,
Então, a
they
nossa
need
abordagem
to
é, no primeiro
have a
momento, sem
process for
dúvida
money
nenhuma,
laundering. So
mudar o
our main
mindset.
approach
É
initially
dizer o
is to
seguinte,
change the
a
mindset.
atividade criminal, o delito,
The
não,
criminal
a
activity
atividade criminal que a gente acostumou a perceber
that
pelo delito vai muito além do
we
tipo penal.
used to
Nós
see in this
precisamos
kind of a
entender o
crime goes
criminoso, a
beyond
atividade
the
criminal e o criminoso
type
como um
of crime. We
empreendedor.
have to
Esse
understand the
indivíduo ele está
criminal
atuando como
as an
investidor, como
entrepreneur.
banqueiro,
They
como
are
empresário, como
working as
promotor,
an investor,
como
as a banker,
transportador,
as
de
a
forma
business person,
profissional e
as a
organizada,
broker, or a
abrindo
delivery person
postos
in a
de
very
trabalho
professional and
para
organized
criminosos
way,
que, se não
opening
houvesse
opportunities for work
aquilo
to
que o
other
Vinícius
criminals.
falado,
If
não
it
teriam,
wasn't for the
não
illicit
passariam de
markets, these
batedor de
criminals
carteira. À
wouldn't
medida que
be
consiga ter um
anything
mercado
but
instalado
pickpockets.
para
But when they have
consumir
a market
produtos
for
como um
the
celular roubado,
consumption of products like a stolen
uma carga de
smartphone
cigarro, uma
or
carga de peças de
basically
veículos,
cigarettes
combustíveis
or
adulterados ou
car
desviados.
parts or
Então, você cria toda uma
fuel,
cadeia
you create
de
a
produção conectada àquele mercado,
production
que tem
chain that is
alguém, em
connected to
regra na
that
posição de
market,
atacadista, né?
who
Ou
is
naquele famoso
basically
atacarejo, né?
which is
Ele tem
basically a market
alguém
that
criando essa demanda e
relies
dando
on
fluidez. Né?
retailers
Nós,
that
nós
create that
temos
kind of
várias
a
evidências do seu
demand for
trabalho.
criminals. Recently, a young criminal was arrested, and he only stole iPhones. And he said that he was paid 1,200 reais for each iPhone, and he spent his time stealing iPhones, but didn't know how to use iPhones. It's not about the sophistication of the agent, but the demand that is perceived, and the demand is out there. The group of illicit markets like drugs, food items, even people through illegal immigration and slave work, animals, illicit market. So this network of markets forms what we call illicit economy, which is going to start sharing actions that they have to conduct. But the way for us to observe that is through the police records. And the police has several records on that. Another way to do that is legal record, like, public prosecution and convictions, because we're talking about an economy that is not a formal one. So we need to capture data about that economy, which is spread out there in at least 71 different types of database in Brazil. And we estimate that there are different sizes, 71 state level databases and 12 federal level databases containing data about these illicit markets. What is necessary for us to do is to find the connection, track all of this data and bring them to light, interpret such data, and make sure we can exemplify the level of illicit activity so we can face them. But the way data is organized, which is basically the legal or police framework, does not enable all of this kind of assessment that I've just mentioned. This is a table from the Paraná database with good processing of data. But look, this is how they place the data. This is the number of thefts organized in the city. But this is not a format which enables us to understand the problem. This is basically a Cinesp database, which has been reworked over a couple of years to see that data differently, but we are limited by the legal definition. But I wanted to draw your attention to the very core of the census. We, as a census, want to burst that bubble and get the data out of the legal realm. Because when we look into robbery, smuggling, traffic, for example, in robbery, I can see smartphones, but this is just a detail. It's not defined by the smartphone market or any other kind of sector, because the basic dimension is the penal typification. And then the same goes for smuggling and so on. And then we can say, is smuggling on the rise or being reduced? How about trafficking? This is a question, but shouldn't we ask the question like, the illicit market for smartphones, has it advanced or has it stepped back? The same goes for drugs, for car parts, for cigarettes. Has it increased or decreased? So we have to reorganize the data and have it segregated, like smartphones, tobacco, drugs. So in here we can list, theft, muggings, and things like that. And that's where the challenge begins. And that's why my presentation is not about one type of data or answering a question whether the market is on the rise or not. We have other indicators. And right now, our work is to say, well, we have been able to find a way to come up with a database that helps us answering that question, because we also need to ask the proper question. What is the drug market? Is it for cocaine? Is it for diluted drug, or is it the base paste? And when we're talking about smartphones, are we talking about iPhones only, or all kinds of smartphones? And police officers are going to ask that question, and the census are going to help them answering that question. And this is the main answer to be provided. And how can we do that after 2 years of hard work? Well, the chart is not very pleasant to the eye, but it's interesting. So we have robbery, smuggling, and traffic. So we organize data under the situational context point of view, when there is no confirmed violence, when there is confirmed violence, so there is a weapon involved, and when it's a sophisticated kind of a crime. The information in the first column, which is basically the situational context, they are really important for us to complement the answer that is provided to fight the problem. So when products are bought with no connection with violence in the modus operandi, it's one type of reply. When there is violence, it's a different kind of reply. And when it's sophisticated, there are integrated activities, basically electronic database, so it takes some time for them to get organized. For anyone who has worked with data, you know how difficult it is to organize things, and we may lose timing on that. And the census looks into doing that kind of a thing for our user.
So we have the history of an occurrence in the event without any theft, without violence. It could be a lady that was walking the street. The criminal was simulating that was a weapon below his shirt, and then he robbed her and stole her two smartphones, SIM cards, for example, and her wallet. And probably if these SIM cards went to a retailer store, so they became into cash for criminals as a resource of revenue. For example, the bus fare card that he also stole can become a product because they can distribute and sell this product. But this is very simple. It's nothing unusual. Yes, but this is illicit market. And a person that has robbed someone, and I can define what product this guy has stolen. And then I can classify this theft, for example, when a criminal steals a car by using a rifle, for example. And this type of information is critical for the analyst. But both crimes were classified in the same penal code. But we have to understand what product was stolen, the SIM card of a smartphone, or a situational thing like a theft, violence. And in the same robbery, for example, in the Brazil region in São Paulo, cargo, clothing, theft, and for example, other situations where criminals would use weapons to steal products. And this registration was made by law enforcement and also a civil guard. And here you see a variety of sources to input this data. And I have the same situation when it comes to smuggling. It's a typical retailing situation with a store with many illegal products, and there was a police officer that went to the store and then could identify this problem. Another cargo that was in São Paulo, in the metropolitan region. Look at what is here. Cigarettes that came from Paraguay. And the same cigarettes that were found by the military police of Paraná State. The same operation, sorry. They found tires, car tires that were being sent to São Paulo, but they were detected in Paraná, the south of Brazil. But they do not involve violence, but always, I cannot say that all smuggling does not involve violence. No, when I read the report here, I find out that it's not, but we have electronics, for example, drugs, weapons, and cigarettes being involved here. So what I want to introduce to you with this example is that this work is very hard to carry out. You have to mine data. But if it's not done, we won't have data available. But when I can process this data, I can bring it to this thing here. Look at this. This is the city of São Paulo. And I made this report in time and space, and then we found out in the market some illicit products in 15 different types of products, and I cannot list all of them here, but I just put some of them: contraband, cargo theft, active corruption, for example. Look at what is interesting here: drug manufacturing, drug trafficking. And then you have the greatest amount here, but along with drugs, you have electronics, weapons, tobacco, and so on and so forth. But when I can organize the data in this fashion, I can have this economic approach. But when I have economics and the economic approach and the situational approach, look what happens here. The electronics market accounts for 41% of the events that they were classified as a violent situation, a violent event. The tobacco, 92% do not use violence, but there is a small part of sophistication. This is the number of events, not the amount, because if you include the amount, it will change the numbers here. But I can organize the markets over here. I can organize the events segmented by market, and then I can show you the scene of the action and the certification of the action as well. Well, what I need to see is this graph here, because I have the illicit market and I have many different chains. I have the production, transport, I have wholesale, retail, distribution. Then I have to go back to the history of events and understand this action. If I'm successful in this work, I'll be able to have a very good description, statistically speaking. So let's think about the tobacco illicit market from 2015 to 2018, and we had 5,800 events, and then there was retail that has this amount, the last line. This is not the estimated value, this is reported value. So this value, this amount is similar to what we find in wholesale, but wholesale has only 5% of the retail. So it confirms the logics and the hypothesis that we have in terms of economy and market. Ladies and gentlemen, that's the first aspect. I have new statistics, which is criminal-based, but also looking at the market. But it's not only about numbers, I mean the advantage. Let's see this event that I have highlighted here. So there is an occurrence, an event in internal production for internal retail in the tobacco illicit market. And this event had a correlation with the drug market. And they were the same place where they apprehended they seized a number of drugs. They also had, they identified that was a place where they would manufacture tobacco. So within Brazil region in São Paulo, the military police had an action over there. They identified a car for cargo carrying tobacco from Paraguay, and they were taken to Carapicuíba, which is in the metropolitan, the southern region of São Paulo in the countryside. And it shows here the following things: the phase of distribution, the role that the city of São Paulo has got in terms of distribution, in the task of making adding value to distribute these products. This is a case where you have a social impact with these illegal markets. And here I have the case of an 11-year-old girl that was sexually abused with child prostitution in the point of sale for illegal distribution sale of tobacco in São Paulo. So the ecosystem that was organized for selling illicit products doesn't have restrictions. Then I can identify this and I can standardize how and show how it is true. And just to wrap up my illustrations, this is a case which is very interesting because it has got many data, lots of data. We have got a region in Brazil, region in São Paulo, and this is a news that was captured by our database, and we know that PCC, which is a drug dealing gang, huge gang in São Paulo, and in this area controlled by PCC has a proliferation of clothing, electronics, and tobacco products, illicit products. And the federal police, the federal police arrested one criminal in the Olympic Games, who was suspected of terrorism.
Essa relação entre terrorismo, ecossistema.
Then this terrorism relation with ecosystem smuggling and contraband is very well segmented in international literature. And when I can organize the data with the market and I can locate the residents and where it was being worked, you can see that's the main hotspots and hot place of tobacco smuggling. And you can see there are a number of products on top of tobacco, automobiles, electronics, retail. So this relation between terrorist networks and proliferation of other products and the structure of market to trade these products is very well explored after the Madrid terrorist attacks, because all the terrorists would work and they would finance this market in such a way in that region, and it was being supported from this terrorist market, I would say. In order to wrap up my presentation, I would like to show why we focused on São Paulo region. This project was organized in 5 phases, and then we're now in the 5th phase. And we progressed, we collected data from São Paulo, metropolitan region. And then why we have chosen this connection? Because it doesn't make sense to think about the problem of Foz do Iguaçu, or Contaporã, or Corumbá, the southern region of Brazil, without thinking about the relation with São Paulo, because there is a triangle, as you can see. It's a great area, which is economic, logistics, and one makes sense to the other one. So the products come through the frontier, the border, and there are many economic spots within this triangle. Of course, it's allegorically speaking, it's a triangle, but of course there are areas that are beyond these borders of the triangle and some other cities that are involved here. But we can only understand the power of the illicit market in this region and in the southern region of Brazil when we understand the relation between them. I love this image because it shows the activity. And this night vision imaging shows the activities of this market. and it shows where there is economic activities, distribution, and you see how the region of São Paulo is highlighted. So when you zoom here, what you see is Rio de Janeiro is here, Belo Horizonte, Foz do Iguaçu is relevant in this area, and Ponta Porã in these other aspects, Paraguay and Argentina. So this connection in this big corridor accounts for 70% of the circulation of illicit products in the country. So everything in terms of drugs, smuggling, theft, especially because of São Paulo's size, then the general situation of these products and the logistics structure is very well concentrated because it follows the logics of the country, the distribution, and any economic activity that is important to Brazil, they have to be connected to São Paulo because São Paulo is a global city that connects all the South America to the other markets and does it in a very intense way. And you can think about the seizures that were done, and 75% of the seizures that happened in 2017 and 2020, between 2017 and 2020, were performed in Guarulhos International Airport in São Paulo. Then in order to keep a low logistics cost, they have to take advantage of the logistics structure that's already present. Then it happens in the country, and then our main road logistics and waterways logistics and airways logistics is in this area, and it reduced the cost for criminal activity. In this map, we have the distribution of roads, and here there are many highways that are very well organized and on tarmac so that this product can reach directly into the source in the north, northeast, or the south. But what is the advantage about São Paulo? You have logistics structure that is installed. They can add value. They can bring products and store them and then redistribute them at a higher cost, and so on and so forth. The same thing happens about to Santos Airport in São Paulo. So 47% that comes from Brazil to Belgium comes from the port of Santos, not the airport, but the port of Santos. So you can see that the port of Santos plays a very important role in this network. So if 47% and the Antwerp port is the main hotspot for illicit products. It happens in Spain, in the Netherlands, and the United Emirates Arabs is very important a player here because of the receiving products, and it's focused on Santos Port, for example. In order to wrap up my talk, this is a scene here that was created, and Europol identified a number of products that were related to this pandemic because of fake vaccines, syringes, face masks, all these products. And when they were identifying the origin of these products, they identified some hotspots: China, Brazil, Europe as well. And I can say that there is a special reason for that. There is a pipeline, a structure, a take that takes products from Paraguay, from Bolivia, and Brazil, that are produced in Brazil as well, and they can be exported. And if this logistics way allows that, it can be reused for any type of products. It's just they need to have an opportunity because the demand is installed in the area. That's just an example that I want to show you. Then the census is an attempt to organize all the pieces of information that the census can have all this data and bring the diagnosis and countermeasures for such a thing. I think I have exceeded my time, but now I give the floor to David so that he can make his considerations. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Joel, for that fantastic presentation and overview of the important work that JHM with its partners are doing on combating illicit markets, not only in the tri-border area, but in Brazil and more regionally. Good morning, bom dia. And again, thank you for this opportunity to share some certainly perspectives and views in this, as I mentioned, this important report project related to the Illicit Market Census platform. Let me thank you, Joel, and Anamara Tomasani for your leadership and hard work in envisioning this important project. As part of the PMI IMPACT initiative, I think this global network is critical towards collective action to combat the illegal trade and illicit markets together. And certainly the partnership that you have established with my good friend, Professor Leandro, and really working with business groups and across civil society in Brazil and in the region, I think will be important, as well with the international community. You know, I think the census is critically important, as you have briefed, not only to pinpoint illicit hubs, trafficking flows, market vulnerabilities. You know, I thought you made a lot of great points about the incidences of violence in communities and how these criminal networks and corruptive influences across supply chains are becoming more and more important. You know, these illicit activities not only impact the tri-border area or Brazil, but really communities across Latin America. It was interesting to see one of your last slides there in Europol, to see the more global illicit pathways of a lot of these illegal goods from the tri-border area to Dubai, to China, to markets in the US and Europe, and also bi-directionally. I think it's important to keep in perspective. And I think the data collected today is incredibly useful for law enforcement communities and other partners to disrupt these illicit markets. And as you underscored, to layer with other economic and market data to help policymakers to better develop anti-crime national policies and programming. You know, I was impressed with the volume of data. I think you said you had 10 million crime records, which is, you know, critical to begin to visualize more dynamically the interconnections between illegal drugs, weapons, electronics, cigarettes, pesticides, and other illicit products, but also other forms of trafficking, like human trafficking, trafficking of wildlife, trafficking of natural resources. You know, this platform and this data began to process to really empower committed law enforcement partners to investigate, to prosecute, and eventually to put some of these criminals and corrupt facilitators behind,
então que fazer toda essa parte
behind bars.
de facilitação que acontece
You know, I think the fact
por trás disso tudo.
that, you know, this platform is a
O
permanent source
impacto
of
é que
microdata is
essa
essential for all
plataforma que trabalha com
sectors
esses dados
that
é
the illicit
essencial para
economy. And
quem trabalha nessa área
I think
e
if you
quem
compare it with
monitora
other
essa economia.
sources, again, you know, it presents, you know, the actionable intelligence to better leverage and combat these illicit markets. Now, let me share why I think this initiative is a true game changer in Brazil and in the region, based on my own experience at the OECD and working with the US government in fighting illicit markets and illicit economies, and now also as the executive director for the International Coalition Against Illicit Economies, ICAIN. You know, evidence-based decision-making really, truly effectively helps us all to fight illicit trade, it does require that evidence-based data and analyses. I think that evidence and good data analytics, again, help policymakers to really harness that critical information to disrupt and dismantle these transnational threats. As a former chair of the OECD Task Force in Countering Illicit Trade and working with business at OECD, and I'm in the business community here in the United States, we're committed to foster these public-private partnerships across borders to really combat illicit markets, because as I mentioned a few minutes ago, what happens in the tri-border in Brazil impacts all of us. And it does require that collective action, those multidisciplinary approaches to fight these illicit markets. The OECD for many years has been able to map more globally some of these illicit trade routes and provided estimates based on evidence-based research, including the trade in counterfeit and pirated goods. For example, in 2019, they released their latest report on fake goods worldwide based on 2016 customs seizure data. And they put that estimate at $500 billion, or 3.3% of world trade. More globally, when you look at the various illicit threats that you just mentioned in your presentation, it's a staggering amount, almost 8% of world GDP. And so the World Bank in 2018 put that GDP, global GDP, at 80 trillion. So 8% of that number is just trillions of dollars in which these illicit wealth proceeds only fund more corruption, more criminality, more insecurity and violence, and destabilizes communities, not only in Brazil, South America, but more globally. Other illicit markets include human trafficking, 150 billion, environmental crime, 200 billion, illegal tobacco, 40 to 50 billion, 6 billion in Latin America. And again, this helps to finance the corruption and money laundering, which both of those constitute several $1 trillion a year. So, and that has grown, especially during COVID and across e-commerce marketplaces and online. Again, this is where I think the census platform and data is critical to really address these converging security concerns, which threaten the health and safety of all people in this important region. The mapping can indeed illustrate that criminal ecosystem that enables to pinpoint large-scale disruptions and identifies or helps to identify other tools to really target more vulnerable points. In Brazil, I love some of the maps that you had there that enables law enforcement and policymakers to concentrate more resources to really combat organized crime and illicit trafficking, not only upstream, but downstream as well. And this is where I think coordinated mitigations and disruption, including the great work that the University of São Paulo is doing in training law enforcement officials in Argentina, Paraguay, in Brazil, and in the region to combat these cross-border threats. The US State Department has found in numerous country reports on international narcotics, money laundering, terrorism, just how serious these threats are in the tri-border area. According to the State Department, the tri-border area is a multi-billion-dollar market for illicit goods, traded narcotics, cocaine, arms, opioids, counterfeits. You mentioned, the organized crime group, the PCC. they have been generating tens of millions of dollars, really, in some instances, collaborating with Hezbollah on drug trafficking operations and money laundering as well. So this creates, the safe haven for an array of bad actors that harms Brazil, the United States, European colleagues, and neighbors all around Brazil and the Americas. According to Interpol, the tri-border does have a lot of challenges, and they do underscore how greater coordination among police and security forces is critical to combat these illicit markets. In the United States, like Brazil, like the tri-border area, counterfeits, pirated goods, contraband, put a lot of Americans at risk and really harms our American economy, our national security. And this is why the US government, as always in a bipartisan manner, has been committed to address the challenges from illicit goods. And again, during COVID-19, when issues of counterfeit personal protective equipment, face masks, fake vaccines online really harm our communities. I think anonymous companies have been a significant enabler of organized crime and illicit trade in the tri-border area in the United States and more globally, and it's becoming easier for criminals to put a lot of this contraband online and e-commerce. And again, these can include very harmful counterfeit medicines that help citizens to address cancer, cholesterol, high blood pressure, and other ailments. So it's very, very, very serious, the dangers that can be posed by counterfeiting and illicit trade all around. Similar to the good points that our duologist made, the DEA, the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, and police at the state and local level truly harness this intelligence-led data. A lot of it comes from seizures of contraband, but they use it to coordinate, to disrupt and dismantle some of these criminal organizations through their intelligence fusion centers. They're able to, again, employ data analytics to identify critical hotspots and, to follow the money trails that is derived from this data based on a lot of arrests and seizures, investigations. So I think the census and its platform can really help Brazil law enforcement and security forces at all levels to combat these illicit markets and the violence related to the criminality and their illicit activities. So a final point, again, congratulations to JHM and the University of São Paulo. I do think that the illicit markets platform does help inform decision makers to legislate and create better authorities, to create better law enforcement tools and resources to combat the multi-dimensional threats and realities posed by organized crime and illicit markets. Based on my own experience, again, working across borders through joint combined law enforcement and security networks can help to coordinate synchronized intelligence-driven law enforcement operations. It also helps to anticipate and to react to the changes in the strategic environment, including the mutations of criminal networks in that criminal ecosystem. And from an international perspective, it does require fighting networks with networks and leveraging these type of panoramic intelligence-based platforms to paralyze, disrupt, and dismantle these illicit networks. Of course, political will at all levels is critical to fight organized crime and related corruption. As chair of the OECD, look forward anti-illicit trade expert group to work with Brazil and other partners in the tri-border area to really towards that collective action that I was talking about, to do more together to disrupt and dismantle these criminal networks. So with that, thank you. Again, very impressed with the work that has been done in this project.
Well, I thank you very much for your participation, David. You are always on the spot, and they really enrich the kind of work we do here. Now we're going to move over to Leandro, and I'd like to tell you that if you have questions, you have the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And you can direct the questions either to myself or to our guests. And I can send this to you as an answer later on if need be. I'd like to just acknowledge some people that are here with us on behalf of the police officers. I'd like to thank Major Paulo Aguilar, one of the references of the Tactical Action Group in the police in São Paulo. He's a great friend and an instructor in the anti-terrorism cell here in São Paulo. Professor Peri Chiquida, one of the main people who opened the first studies of illicit markets in Brazil, and Leonardo Ruiz, the director of Fiesp, one of the young leaderships in the startup area. So it's basically the three pathways that we move forward. And this is basically where I live, you know, this is my home, the police I worked with, the university I studied at, and the Fiesp, the place where I learned about the business to close that triumvirate. So, Leandro, it's up to you now, your comments. Thank you very much, João Henrique, for inviting me to be here. It's a great honor to be a part of the launch of the illicit market census. And I'd like to thank for the opportunity to listen to David one more time with very precise analysis on the relevance of this kind of a work for the cooperation amongst security agencies and justice bodies at the international level. And this kind of work has a very important consequence. And I agree with everything that David said. And I wanted to be able to add to what has been said and just overlap some of the comments that have been made here by stating that I understand the census has the potential to conduct a huge cooperation for public policies in control of illicit markets in South America. We are talking about a region that is quite troublesome when it comes to the dynamics of global illicits. And South America is the region that produces the whole of the cocaine that is consumed all over the world. So Paraguay and Brazil represent, as the João Henrique Martins study shows, a region which is extremely vulnerable and a platform for several types of illicit business and operations. I wanted to mention the point of view of a partner of our initiative. As João Henrique said, we have been selected at the same time to receive funding to do different things and a highly complementary effort. So we have been making all the efforts to put all the initiatives together in this process, as we did in several moments in our professional career back in the day. And I wanted to highlight the three main things that I believe that this work is very positive about. So the first one is about the analytical proposition of having the focus on illicit businesses, not in corporations or structures that stem off these kind of businesses like these represent opportunities for groups which grow in complexity and capacity of organization, and then they exploit this kind of a business. So I think that this is a correct reading, and it's in line with the literature on organized crime, which moves the traditional analysis that was focused on the organization itself and places that as a focus on the activity itself. So we have to understand the activity. The examples that João has introduced in his introduction are quite examples that João has introduced in his introduction are quite descriptive and very good when we can understand the steps that add to this kind of a process. We can understand the impact on the chain of other illicit crimes and illicit activities. This may look like it's the run of the mill, it's an ordinary thing, but it's not. When one talks about organized crime in Brazil, they don't take into account the illicit activity itself, because that starts with the organization itself. So the main current when it comes to studies and reflections in this area, they prioritize the organization. Even in the scope of justice and police, which spend a long time looking into the organization and thinking quite little about the kind of business they dedicate themselves to. And quite often, the information about the activity itself is quite revealing on our capacity to understand the phenomenon and redesign public policies and answers to fight these kind of activities.
Then we have the relation between supply and demand that we have to understand it in all processes, because we have different types of consumers, we have different types of suppliers, and the type of organization that arises from that, maybe it's more violent or less violent, it's related to corruption or not, or competition among other agents in the same sector. And all these questions, it can be understood when we run an analysis of these dynamics of the business, of the deals. Then I believe it's an extraordinary choice in terms of analytics. And it kind of makes us avoiding us to have the idea that but in fact, the organized crime is a political, economical, organized institution. And one of the great puzzles that we have got here is to understand PCC from São Paulo, because it's very difficult to understand them as an organization. And why that? Because there is little interest in that and a little capacity to analyze the deals that are being managed by PCC. And it's not centralized. PCC doesn't have a single cash flow or having a centralized command, but it's a constellation of small businesses that organize the retail of cocaine and other products as well. For example, the theft of ATMs, robberies of banks, and they are operated by small businesses that are interconnected to this great infrastructure of PCC that is also connected to the prison system. And of course, it wouldn't bring this to the debate, but I can say that the census and the analytical part of the census help us out to understand how important it is to investigate the business itself and the base of the activity, and to see what are the economic and concrete interests that are presented in these specific needs of activities. And from that point on, we can understand better how these organizations are created and how networks of organizations are created as well. Well, I believe that the second great point that I attribute to the census is the focus on the network and the logistics chain. So these two roles are very important in the whole process, of course, because we can understand the spatial impact as well as the impact on the region that these activities bring. If these businesses are small and fragmented in the illicit market, they are small somehow, but the organization of these networks in the geography make this activity very threatening for public safety and for the government and society as well. And the third one would be the focus on public policies and the defense of in these internal activities. The census look at this problem, looking at the public policies that can be and could be designed and generated. It would be answers to these problems. Yeah, of course, it is an instrument and it's a group of information data, but it's also a tool that can help the lawmakers to create public policies. In a nutshell, I can say that the census is perfect, analytically speaking, when focusing on illicit markets, and the census applied the correct methods for seeing the impact in the space and networks, and because of that, it opens new doors for us to think about public policies that are very necessary to respond to these threats. And based upon these three important points that I have just talked about, I also attribute the possibility of having some key impact of this work. First one, and I directly get benefits from that, which is the training of police officers, because I have a project with the support of Philip Morris in Batch, and it is a police officer training program. It's an international course of the University of São Paulo that organized the first course of international security in the borders, and then now we're going to start a second group in June. And I've already made the invitation, and João is going to present the census to our students. I mean, it's an atlas, it's a map. It's a map that's going to deliver all this information, and it will be impacting the process of training of the students, because they'll be able to take a deep dive in these analytical models that are proposed so that they can understand this innovation that the census brings to everyone. Another important dimension is research. Academic research. That's another invitation that I've made to him. He has already accepted. I have a number of researchers and students in the postgrad because they study this topic. And I believe that this work will help a lot. Because without data, we cannot have research. And as I said before, we have challenges with public policies, and David also emphasized that in his talk. It has a direct impact in the process with the lawmakers, because public policies that are integrated to groups, companies, and how they could be formed so that they can be benefited from the good analysis and good information so that they can help to form these public policies. I can say that this project is very innovative, and it has reviewed the possibilities that are concrete for criminal analysis. Then law enforcement can learn and get benefited from the census, not only from the data, but also from the analytical models that are proposed. And if you allow me, João, I believe that you have a challenge right now, which is to produce a new edition of this material. And I would say that the analytical part is so rich, and it could have a separated publication. I think you should present that in details in a more simplified way, and it would become an instrument, a tool of criminal analysis. And then I believe this is a component of this census that you have presented to us. Another component that is very important, which is the result of this model application, which is analytical and having all this data that is produced by it. And it's possible to be producing this data and related to the whole process and related to the illicit markets of the region. And with this publication, you can confirm the vision that you have had since the beginning when you worked at FIES, when you were analyzing illicit markets. And these are very important publications when you were there, that you have produced these publications. But unfortunately, yes, we stopped producing these publications. But you helped us a lot with information, with data, and related to the three dimensions that I mentioned: the training, the research, and the criminal analysis applications for security and public policies. So data, information, these analytical models that are very adequate. So with these tools, we can win. We can face threats that are so huge that impact our economy, our health, and people in general, society. And this is a great challenge that we have got. So congratulations once again. Thank you, Leandro. Well, I would like to answer some questions. And I would like to remind you that this event starts our process to disclose all the activities that we have, that we can develop from now on. And I would like to respond to Leandro's questions. And of course, we have two aspects. We have a number of technological solutions and also the methodology, the analytical part. But we want to provide a course, a training course that will help people to learn how to use the census. It's like a tutorial course to teach people how to use this census. And of course, we want to have the captain and the police chief that is there also, that's going to be using these census organizing data that's focused on the law enforcement, and that we also want to provide this census to the private sector for logistics, to manage their losses, so that they can understand the market. So if you have registered for this event, you have all your email, so you'll be able to send all the information about these courses. We're going to advance in terms of training. In terms of the lawmaker that David has highlighted, for sure, from the very beginning, we have interfaces, people, agents that are talking in the parliament, and we are forming a group within the parliament. And at that time, we have the congressman that is a contemporaneous person who is with me, and we have talked to this congressman. And he was my student in the academia when we were talking about illicit economy, and now he's a congressman, and more he's positioning himself in terms of this topic, among other congressmen. Now I need to mention Dr. Valdomiro Guinesp, a coordinator of Procarga project, in the Dr. Troncon, who retired from the Federal Police in São Paulo, who is here too. Luciano Coelho, who is the coordinator for Fiesp security department. I'm sorry, I cannot see everybody here and remember everybody, but I just highlight some that are here present. Well, I'm going to ask Ana Maura to handle the questions. She has selected some. Hello, everyone. Good morning, everyone. It's a great honor to have you all with us. Thank you very much for all the questions that have been posed here. There are many questions. We won't have enough time to answer all of them, but I have selected some of them, the first ones, that you can answer them. Let's go. First one is by Edilson Esteves and says the following. I realize, but maybe I'm mistaken, that there is a gap in the information exchange in terms of environmental crimes. So what is the possibility in having an effective participation of federal environmental entities to work, to relate to this work that was presented? And then we have another one from Tiago Cortes, congratulations on the work. I'm really glad to see the great results. My question is for Professor João. Professor João, by collecting all this data from the events and all the investigations of the military police, I can realize that there is a position of criminal organizations throughout the chains of illicit market in this triple border. So what seems to be true in terms of the form of these organizations, in terms of building the market that would shape these organizations? Well, these censuses will be bringing knowledge and methods of work for law enforcement. I believe that the lack of existence of unification of registrations of events would make things bring difficulties for law enforcement entities here in Brazil. Is this the objective, to unify this information with the census? And then he brings another thing. In order to understand the question, there is nothing in Brazil in terms of cargo theft is. So not necessarily what happens in the States is the same thing that happens in other states. So that was a comment that he has made, and I'm going to read a last question, which is by Marcílio. Good morning, Lieutenant Marcílio from the Military Police of São Paulo. I'd like to know from you your point of view in terms of state-based military police and how to make the qualitative analysis of the census. And then we would establish the hotspots, parameters to fight these crimes from the logistics chain. The question is if there is any kind of initiatives for research for recovery of assets. Of course, we have other questions. We'll try to answer these questions in the future by email or through another way. And I got the first questions so that we can discuss about them. So these are the questions, Ron. Thank you so much. Well, fantastic for questions. Gilson, yes, the wildlife market and pets and related to environment, these are illicit markets that are included within the census. And I can show you a screen that shows a good example of the types of different types of studies that we're going to advance. And here I'm answering to Marceli's question as well. Look at this. This is a small sample of 1,770,000 events. And here I have in the first three columns, I just give you an idea on how this illicit market is changed in terms of violence that is practiced by the criminals. Here I can pick the example of a category that can be broken down, of course. But for wildlife and pets, within this over 1 million, we have over 1,700 events. 60% of these events were practiced without violence. So 31%, almost 1/3, has violent elements. There was no sexual abuse, but there was 4 lethal events. It can be a murder, an attempt of murder, or other types. And over here I have the diagnosis, and then I have this cut upon these numbers, and of these 1,768 events, that was São Paulo, Paraná, Mato Grosso do Sul, Federal Police, and then we organized all this data. And then you ask me on how the federal public bodies could take advantage of that. So I could set up a meeting right now. I could show everything and what other markets are related to these markets. For example, the drugs market, it's always related to all the other markets because they created like a duct that makes things easier to be distributed. So there is a number of information that we can organize and exchange information. But what is critical in my point of view is that we need to have access to the data, the macro data. For example, today we have a serious problem because there is no regular conduct in the organizations, and then there are moments that I make a request in the security department, and then they have some kind of difficulties to share this information.
The partnerships we can have with the federal, state, and municipal bodies are basically the same size of the problem. So we need a broad partnership and bring a lot of these players to have a lot of this exchange of information in real time. Also, Lieutenant Marcelius said that, that there are several researches out there, and there is almost like a scenario research to try and understand who's operating in your area, why they're operating in there, and why they're using your area specifically. And there is a lot of research that can be done to get the teams on the ground. At least operational kind of work is something that we're trying to sanitize and through the studies that we are putting together and connecting with the platform that is available for police officers. But the scenario and structure is something that requires the assembly of teams, and it's important to have several actors. We are open to do that within the police centers, and we can extend this to the police training centers. And these centers are connected to civil police bodies. And this is a kind of a study that you do in a more of a structured way and in a more organized fashion. Well, to try and help the question that Tiago asked, to try and help answering that, this is basically the market that shapes the organizations. And why is it? For the same reason that, most of us prefer iPhones to other smartphones. So the market adapts to that. We didn't think about the iPhone first. We go out to the market looking for smartphones that have a certain feature, and then the market provides the feature. So demand is there for a real need, but the offer is structured based on the capacity and profitability for meeting that particular demand. So a criminal or any other criminal organization is not going to reinvent the market. We're going to look at that and say, okay, what has high profitability and lower cost? They will try to be a monopolist and try to operate on that particular area. This is another module that we're going to have in the course that we will have to look into. And you have to fight the activities in the market, as Leandro said. If you don't fight the market, it's going to become attractive to other criminal operators to come up with their offer. In this panel, I give you an example of this market, like the electronic market, for example. This market has mobilized basically 506,000 events. So this is pretty exciting as a market for criminals. So this is a very violent market. Almost 60% of all initiatives produce some kind of a criminal activity. We have 25 rapes that happen during the acquisition of the product. A person tries to rob a woman or a teenager, and they use the opportunity to rape that person. It doesn't matter what happens. This is the type of a crime that shows that the individual have a very low perception of risk. On top of mugging the item, they captured the victim and took the person to a place for the sexual abuse. 39 people have been killed because of this market, and 13 confrontations happened. So in this last column in here, which is something that we're going to be covering quite soon, we talk about police lethality. But that's not the cause of the problem. The cause is which market is as violent as this one that places criminals in direct conflict with the police. This is a very meaningful information. We have 40 direct confrontation with the police when it comes to weapons, ammunition, and explosives. So acquiring weapons, put people in confront with the police, and then drugs, 23. But, before that, car parts and car theft. And some markets have zero confrontation with the police. That doesn't mean that it's not dangerous. It means that, that the MO of anyone operating in this area is something that does not contemplate this kind of confront, because confront is always there. If confrontation is required, of course, criminals will prepare to fight the police. So for each of these columns, we have, different types of research that have been conducted so we could understand the business and the structure of illicit markets. One has to understand whether your area is a wholesale or retail area, or if it's a transportation area, and what you can expect in order to fight this kind of a criminal. And the question by Dr. Neves Without a doubt, our goal is to help bridging this gap by integrating data. We know that a series of problems take place on the transaction of such information. The only thing that is a federation in Brazil is public security. Autonomy for actors is there, but it requires responsibility, and we need to have integrated data, because if we exchange the head of a sector, we go back to scratch. We start the communication from scratch, and this has to do with the confidence in public security teams and so on and so forth. But since we're focused on solving the problem and looking into the perspective of the civil society, because the state has a role to play, but we want to improve the actions in this market, and the census is extremely important in that effect. We have partnerships with universities and with organizations like OECD, and ever since 2016, when I was involved in the task force meeting, we have been keeping in touch with all the players and maintaining the conversation flow, because in the civil society we can be a bit faster when it comes to structuring all of that. So the census is geared to being a tool at your disposal to integrate all of that kind of an information. Leandro, David, if you have any additional comments, please, the floor is all yours. Well, I wanted to say quite quickly about the example and the correlation between market and organizations. A very good example for us to understand that is when a product is submitted to either a new production system or restriction of access, or when there is some kind of a shortage in the market. So ethanol, for example, the United States did that. They have declared that it was illegal. In fact, it's not ethanol, it's basically the beverage industry was going through a moment where the government declared the dry law and people could not drink alcohol anymore, so that enabled a lot of criminal organizations to rise. And when that restriction was removed, the traditional beverage companies took over, and they can produce alcoholic beverages a lot better than illegal companies. The same thing goes with marijuana. For example, the legalization of marijuana has brought in professional entrepreneurs that operate in the cannabis business, and the crime that surrounded this kind of a commodity, so to speak, disappeared. So when there is this change and an item stops being forbidden and becomes legal, or the other way around, in the 20s when alcohol was forbidden, one can observe quite clearly that the organized crime steps to the fore and takes over these opportunities that the demand requires. There's a market there, and if the asset is regulated by the government and deemed illegal, this is going to be produced by someone else, by an organization or group of people who are going to engage into this activity, and this can grow in complexity over time. I think that this is one of the main lessons one can have in this market. So thank you very much for inviting me to be here today, and thank you for the questions as well. They have been really good.
Yeah, on the point of environmental crime, if you look at the rich Brazil is blessed with a lot of natural resources. But, as we see in Colombia, as we see in Peru, criminals gravitate more to other illicit markets like gold, like oil, while trafficking was mentioned. So, there's a plundering natural resources. And, again, this is an area that was raised by the question where I do think perhaps more data on natural resources, not only wildlife, but, you look at logging, the Amazon, right? You look at fishing, and again, issues of minerals, very important, I think, for Brazil. And from a diplomatic perspective, Joel, you mentioned, the OECD, we'll continue to work with the OECD. I hope Brazil can also take leadership in the G20 and, to look at these issues. I am a member of the B20, where I'm trying to elevate the issue of illicit markets. So, it would be great as you brief your members of parliament, of Congress, the president, administrations, to really elevate and really leverage the data that you have developed, again, in partnership with the University of São Paulo. I think it is important, and again, in the area of natural resources, I do think that Brazil can be a global leader in really encouraging communities across sectors to look at the specific harms and ways to mobilize energies to combat these illicit markets. So thank you.
Bem, agradeço mais uma vez, exatamente isso. Inclusive,
all very much.
Chegou hoje de manhã, tem uma revista
This morning I received an issue of a magazine called Pesquisa, and the cover of this magazine is on the traffic of fossils. This is a scientific magazine that has awoken to this kind of a problem, and we have seen this everywhere. This is a very good example, so thank you very much for that, David. I would like to thank your attendance here today, David. Thank you very much. I know that you have a very busy schedule and that you have been supporting our work quite strongly, and we have a deep appreciation for all the work that we have developed and the partnership we've had with you. Thank you very much, and I hope that we can meet shortly for a deeper collaboration. Leandro, thank you very much for all of your kind words and all of your observations. There was a moment where we had 116 people here with us today, and people at the top of the crop, so to speak, police, academia, business people. So it's a great mix, and it's important to be able to talk to them. And I'd like to wrap this up by stating that we can only do this kind of work because of two main reasons. One of them, it's the PMI program, which has made all of this program a reality and all the efforts we put in place a reality. And the second one is the police forces. They have been working a lot in the apprehension of products, and without their work, we wouldn't have any data to evaluate. So the military police of São Paulo, Paraná, Mato Grosso do Sul, the civilian police, the special border police forces, the federal road police that has done a lot of apprehensions in the road, the road police, and the border patrol police unit. And we've had cooperations with several polices like in São Paulo and Europe, and so we have been able to raise a lot of information based on what we have been made privy to and the access to the information we've had. And all these seizures have been documented, and that has helped us document all of the process and at the level of the police, at the city, state, and country level. I'd like to thank all of you for your attendance here, and I'd like to tell you that this presentation is going to be made available on YouTube, and it's going to be made available in English, Portuguese, and Spanish, and we're going to be here for you in the next event. So thank you very much, and I'd like to congratulate all of you and thank you for your attendance.